On November 9th, 1986, 47-year-old Pedro Oliva Ramirez left Seville for a neighboring town and disappeared from the road he knew so well for exactly 60-odd minutes. When he returned home, the clock on the dashboard of his Seat showed a time that could not possibly correspond to the distance he had traveled. But what he told his wife and neighbors that same night turned out to be so precise in its details and so implausible in its content that Spanish paranormal investigators have still not reached a consensus on the nature of what happened. This story did not receive widespread publicity, not because it was covered up, but because there was no way to explain it. Pedro Oliva Ramirez was born on March 22, 1939, in the province of Seville, in the small municipality of Utrera. His father was a small grain merchant. His mother was a homemaker. Pedro received a technical education in Seville and spent almost his entire professional life working as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop in the Triana neighborhood. By the mid-1980s, he was no longer working directly for the company. He ran his own small workshop for repairing agricultural machinery on the outskirts of the city, in the Polígono Carretera Amarilla industrial zone. The workshop provided a modest but steady income. By nature, he was a meticulous and taciturn man. Colleagues and neighbors described him as a man of order. He was never late, did not abuse alcohol, and never told tall tales. His wife, Consuelo Ramirez Ibanez, later said that in 22 years of marriage, she had never once heard her husband say anything she couldn't verify. Pedro traveled to Alcalá de Guadaira regularly. This small town lies about 16 kilometers east of Seville, by local standards practically a suburb. There he had a longtime client, a farmer named Antonio Lopez Mora, whose tractor Pedro had been servicing for several years. Antonio ran his farm on the western outskirts of Alcalá, near the road to Hospitalet. The route was standard. Head out along Avenida de Andalucía, then turn onto a secondary road through the Torreblanca neighborhood toward the eastern entrance to Alcalá. Pedro had driven this road, by his own estimate, at least 40 times. He knew it by heart. He knew where the road narrowed before the bridge over the canal. He knew the distinctive scent of the olive groves in that spot in the fall. He knew exactly where the streetlights began on the approach to the city. On November 9th, 1986, he left late, around 10:30 at night. The reason was practical. Antonio Lopez Mora had called in the afternoon and asked him to pick up some O-rings for the tractor's hydraulic system. They needed to be installed before the morning sowing. Pedro gathered the parts, packed them into a canvas bag, and poured coffee into a thermos. His Seat 131 was parked in the workshop yard. According to Consuelo, her husband left the house at 11:15 and said he would be back no later than midnight. The drive took at most 25 minutes one way. The night was quiet. According to meteorological data for the province of Seville for that day, November 9th, 1986, the air temperature dropped to 8 degrees Celsius by nightfall. The sky was clear and the wind was minimal. The moon was in its first quarter, waxing about half lit, and over the plain east of Seville hung that peculiar, almost tactile darkness that the locals call Boca de Lobo, the wolf's mouth, when the city lights no longer reach the horizon and the moonlight is barely enough to make out the silhouettes of olive trees along the road. Pedro set off along his usual route. The first few kilometers went by as usual. He passed the fork at the Texaco gas station, which was open until 10 o'clock at night and was already closed by then. He passed the railroad crossing at the 5-kilometer mark, where the tracks hadn't yet been buried. He turned onto a secondary road through Torreblanca, a narrow 2-lane road familiar to Pedro down to the last pothole, and it was right here, on the stretch between the 8th and 9th kilometers from the Seville exit, that something went wrong. Later, Pedro described that moment as follows. The road, which he knew as a straight stretch with a slight leftward slope before the grove, suddenly took a wrong turn. Not sharply, not suddenly, but smoothly, as if the familiar route continued, but now in a different space. He didn't feel a jolt, didn't hear a screech, didn't notice an obstacle. It was simply that at some point, the road ceased to be the one he knew and became something else. Before him lay a 6-lane highway. This in itself defied all geographical reality. In 1986, there wasn't a single 6-lane highway within a 30-kilometer radius of Seville. The roads most similar to it in terms of specifications were located in completely different directions. What now lay before the Seat's headlights was a wide, perfectly straight, perfectly smooth stretch of road. divided into 6 lanes by white markings. On both sides of the road, there were no groves, no streetlights, no buildings, only darkness, and the road stretching ahead as far as the headlights could reach. Pedro stopped the car. He got out. The air outside seemed much warmer to him than it should have been in November. Not hot, just warm, like in mid-September, around 20 degrees. He remembered this well because as soon as he got out of the car, he unbuttoned his jacket. It wasn't cold. The ground by the roadside was dry and hard. The asphalt looked new. No cracks, no greasy stains, no gravel dust. Pedro would later say that in those first few seconds, he thought about road construction. Maybe he had accidentally driven onto a section of a newly paved road. But even that assumption didn't hold up. Roads under construction are cordoned off, closed, and lit by equipment. Here, there was nothing. He looked around. His peripheral vision caught something in the distance, about 150 to 200 meters from the road, he estimated. He couldn't describe it clearly. Not luminous objects, not machinery, not structures. Rather, they were volumes. Dark, motionless forms that were massive enough to stand out against the sky. He looked in that direction and had the feeling that these forms were not merely standing there, but were present, as if they were not geological formations, but something possessing a character of its own. Then he added that he felt neither fear nor attraction, only a strange, incomparable sense of incongruity, as if you were looking at a set that looked right but was obviously not real. And then he heard voices. Not from the car, not from the darkness ahead, from somewhere to the side, on the same side where those indistinct shapes stood. The voices were soft and not directed at him. They sounded like background conversation in the next room, where you can hear the intonation, but not the words. According to his description, it was a chorus, not a single source, but several all at once. After a while, he couldn't say exactly how many minutes because, in his words, time felt different at that moment. One voice stood out from the general background, clear, even, devoid of emotional coloration, neither male nor female, just a voice. And this voice said something in Spanish that Pedro later repeated in various interviews, with minor variations, but always with the same core meaning. Don't be afraid. You have been transported to another dimension. You will not get lost. Pedro got back into the car. Later, he himself found it difficult to explain this decision. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He got in and drove forward along the 6-lane highway, simply because there was nothing else left to do. As he noticed, there was no road behind him. When he turned around, behind him was the same straight, wide stretch of road as in front. No exit, no side road from which he might have just come. He drove on. It felt like about an hour. The speedometer read roughly 80 kilometers per hour. If these figures were correct, he must have covered about 80 kilometers. But the highway had remained the same the whole time, straight, smooth, with no interchanges, no bridges, and no roadside signs. Not a single kilometer marker, not a single signpost. It was then that Pedro glanced at the odometer, and that, he said, frightened him far more than anything he had seen before. The odometer showed that the car had traveled only 14 kilometers from Seville. The engine had been running non-stop for over an hour. The speedometer read 80. The distance, 14. These numbers couldn't exist at the same time. Several cars had passed him during that time. This was, perhaps, the most precisely documented detail of his story, because he remembered it with mathematical precision. Cars appeared at exactly 8-minute intervals. Each time, one car traveling in the same direction. Not a single oncoming car. Not once was the interval broken. 8 minutes, one car, 8 minutes, one car. Pedro noticed this after the second car and deliberately kept track of the time using the clock on the dashboard. The interval did not vary. The cars were old. Not rare, not vintage, just old in the sense that they looked outdated. According to his description, their shapes resembled European models from the 1960s and early 1970s, with the smooth, slightly bulging body lines characteristic of that era. But he didn't recognize any specific makes, even though, as a mechanic, he was well acquainted with most European cars of that time. The cars drove confidently, at a normal speed, without stopping or paying any attention to him. The license plates were unfamiliar. Pedro described them as white or beige rectangles, narrow and long, disproportionately stretched horizontally, lacking the familiar aspect ratio of Spanish or European license plates of that time. He couldn't make out the symbols on them. The speed and the night lighting didn't allow it, but he remembered the shape well. About an hour later, That's exactly how he put it at the time. He saw a sign. Turn left. A standard metal road sign from the Ministry of Development, a white shield with a green border. It read, Alcalá, Málaga, Seville. 3 names in a column, but there were no numbers. Not a single one. No kilometer distance to Alcalá, nor to Málaga, nor to Seville. Just 3 words on metal, as if someone had put up a sign without knowing or wanting to specify how far away. He turned toward Seville. The road quickly returned to normal. Within a few minutes, he recognized the area. Roadside signs, the familiar contours of the hills, the lights of a distant city on the horizon. But then, something happened that finally shattered his attempt to make sense of everything that had happened. After about 12 to 15 minutes of driving, he saw lights on the right that he recognized immediately. It was the eastern entrance to Alcalá de Guadaira. He had almost reached his destination, even though he was heading towards Seville. And then Pedro realized another problem. Antonio Lopez Mora ran his farm on the western side of the city. To get there, he had to drive right through Alcalá, from east to west. Under normal circumstances, that would take about 15 minutes. But at that moment, Pedro couldn't bring himself to drive into the city. Later, he explained it this way. He had just jumped 16 kilometers in some inexplicable way, and the thought that the same thing might happen again, inside the city blocks, in the dark, with no way to find his bearings, was unbearable. Besides, when he reached for the canvas bag of spare parts lying on the passenger seat, it turned out to be unexpectedly damp, not on the outside, but all the way through, as if it had been lying for several hours in a rain that hadn't fallen. The parts were fine, the packaging intact, but the bag itself was soaked through. Pedro pulled his hand away. At that moment, he made a decision. Antonio would get the parts in the morning. He stopped. He sat in the car for a few minutes, thinking of nothing. Then he turned around and drove back to look for that intersection, that sign, that 6-lane highway. He found nothing. He drove that stretch 3 times back and forth. The road was a normal 2-lane road through olive groves. No 6-lane highway, no sign with 3 cities, no turn he could remember or recognize. Pedro Ramirez arrived home at 2 in the morning. Consuelo was waiting for him. According to her, he looked perfectly normal, not flustered, not frightened, but very serious. She asked why he was so late and where the parts were. He sat down at the table, poured himself some water, and told her everything, without pausing, leaving out no detail. Consuelo later said that at that moment, she didn't know what to think. Her husband didn't seem like someone who had gone through severe stress, nor like someone who was making up a story. He looked like someone describing a traffic accident, precise, consistent, and unembellished. The next morning, Pedro drove to Antonio Lopez Mora's place and delivered the parts. Antonio noticed that the canvas bag was damp on the outside. Not wet, just damp, as if it had been in the fog or exposed to a temperature change. The night had been dry. There had been no rain either before or after. No one could explain the origin of this moisture. Later, Pedro told Antonio what had happened that night. Antonio, in his own words in later interviews, was skeptical of the story, but was struck by how methodically and calmly Pedro recounted it. He wasn't agitated, Antonio said. He was precise. For the first few days after the incident, Pedro took no active steps. He returned to the same route 3 times at different times of day, with and without his wife, and each time drove the stretch between the 8th and 9th kilometers in both directions. The highway did not appear. The area looked completely normal. About 2 weeks after the incident, one of Consuelo's nieces, who worked in Seville at a small regional magazine, mentioned the story to her editor, Fernando Casal Martinez, who was covering unusual phenomena at the time. Casal contacted Pedro, who agreed to an interview. A recording of this interview has been preserved, first in the editorial office's archives, and later transferred to private hands. It was this recording that became the first documentary evidence. Casal was not a sensationalist. His magazine, Andalucía Desconocida, had a circulation of about 2,000 copies and specialized in regional studies, with separate sections on local folklore and mysterious phenomena. He interviewed Pedro 3 times, with intervals of several days between each interview. The testimony did not change in any significant detail. This struck him. According to him, people who invent or reconstruct non-existent events from memory inevitably vary the details during repeated interviews. Such is the nature of memory. Pedro, however, recounted his story with a precision that Casal later compared to the testimony of an experienced technical expert. He remembered every fact, and every fact remained exactly the same. The article was published in February 1987. It was short, with no illustrations. It took up less than a page and a half of the magazine. The reader's reaction was unexpected. The editorial staff received about 30 letters from people reporting their own strange experiences on the roads of the province of Seville. Most of them were irrelevant, but 3 letters caught Casal's attention. The first was from a resident of Dos Hermanas, a small town south of Seville, who described a similar episode involving a road that turned out to be the wrong one, though without mentioning the 6-lane highway. The second was from a retiree in Mairena del Alcor, who spoke of warm air on a cold night road in the same area several years ago. The third was anonymous, handwritten in block letters. The author claimed to have worked on road construction in the province and that, in that area, in the late 1970s, they found something under the ground, and work was immediately halted and the crew transferred to another site without explanation. The letter contained neither a name nor an address nor any identifying details. Casal attempted to identify its author, to no avail. The incident itself did not elicit an official response. The civil guard of the province of Seville, to whom Casal sent a written inquiry describing the incident, responded with a standard statement. The report received does not contain any indications of a criminal offense. The local road authority did not respond to the inquiry at all. Nevertheless, the story of Pedro Oliva Ramirez has enjoyed limited but steady circulation within the Spanish-speaking community interested in paranormal phenomena. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, several Spanish researchers of anomalous phenomena included this case in their publications. Among them was Manuel Garcia Bregas, author of several books on unexplained incidents on the roads of the Iberian Peninsula, who published an expanded account in his 1992 anthology. Bregas personally met with Pedro in 1991, almost 5 years after the incident, and recorded his testimony again. According to Bregas, Pedro's account had not changed in any way by that time. This in itself requires an explanation. Psychologists studying memory have long established that memories of traumatic or unusual events tend to become embellished. Over time, people add details that should have been there and fill in the gaps. Pedro did not do this. He did not add new characters, new dialogue, or new details about objects by the roadside. He did not embellish his account to make it more sensational. His account in 1991 was structurally identical to the one from 1986. In the 1990s, interest in the case gradually waned along with a general decline in public interest in paranormal phenomena in Spain. In 2003, Fernando Casal passed away. His archive, including the original recordings of interviews with Pedro, passed to his daughter, Lourdes Casal Gomez. She preserved the materials but took no steps to publish them. In 2010, Lourdes Casal approached a group of independent researchers of anomalous phenomena operating in Seville under the unofficial name Archivo Betica. The group consisted of about 10 people, mostly with academic backgrounds, physicists, historians, and one psychologist. They specialized specifically in verifying archival materials, not in searching for new cases, but in documenting and verifying those already known. Lourdes provided them with her father's audio recordings and written transcripts. The group worked with the materials for about 2 years. At the same time, they tracked down Pedro Oliva Ramirez. By then, he was already in his 70s, living in the same neighborhood of Seville as before, leading a quiet life in retirement. Consuelo had passed away by then, in 2008. Pedro's children, his son Jorge and daughter Beatriz, lived separately. Pedro agreed to meet with the researchers once. According to Carlos Ornelas Luna, a physicist and the de facto leader of the group, Pedro received them calmly, offered them coffee, and told the whole story again, exactly the same way he had in 86 and 91. He spoke slowly and precisely, Ornelas noted, like a man reciting a well-memorized lesson, only this lesson was his own life. At the same time, Pedro refused to go to the site of the incident. Not categorically, not emotionally. He simply said that he had already been there many times and that there was nothing there. "It's just a road," Ornelas quoted him as saying. "I don't know exactly where it was. I don't know if that place even exists." The Archivo Betica group conducted its own fieldwork. That section of the secondary road between Seville and Alcalá, from the 7th to the 12th kilometer, was thoroughly investigated. Topographic surveys revealed flat terrain with no geological features, no signs of an old roadbed, additional pavement or construction work were found. However, in the archives of the Provincial Construction Authority for the period from 1974 to 1984, the team discovered a gap. The technical documents for this specific section of the road for those 8 years were missing from the registry. Not lost, not destroyed, simply missing, as if they had never been submitted for storage. The administration explained this as discontinuities in archiving, typical of a period of administrative restructuring. The archivist, whom Ornelas consulted, shrugged and said that such gaps were not uncommon. The team's psychologist, Pilar Fuentes Aguirre, had 2 long conversations with Pedro. Her conclusions were cautious. She found no signs of distorted thinking, paranoid tendencies, or a tendency toward confabulation. His cognitive profile was completely normal for a man of his age. The repetitive nature of the story, which remained unchanged, could, in her words, indicate either that the event was real and deeply ingrained, or that Pedro had told it so often that the story had hardened, turning into an unchanging narrative. The problem was that Pedro had told practically no one about this. He didn't like the story, didn't want fame, and didn't talk about it with his neighbors. It was impossible to explain where such consistency in the accounts came from. There was one more element that the Betica archive attempted to verify separately: the 8-minute interval between the cars. Pedro insisted that he had timed it using a watch. The team attempted to verify whether the clock on the dashboard of the specified Seat 131 model could have been malfunctioning, for example, running slow or fast. A car of the same model and approximately the same year of manufacture was found and tested. The clock worked correctly. Furthermore, an 8-minute interval is not a psychologically convenient number. If Pedro had been fabricating the story or reconstructing it from memory, he would most likely have chosen 10 minutes or half an hour. 8 minutes is a number that is hard to invent but easy to remember if you timed it. By 2013, the group had completed a documentary report of about 120 pages. The report was not published in academic journals. The group tried, but received rejections with standard phrases about the lack of verifiable evidence. Some of the materials were posted on Spanish-language websites, while others remained in the private archives of the group's members. As for Pedro, his life after 1986 appeared to remain normal. He continued to work, raised his children, and ran his workshop. However, his son Jorge noted in a 1999 interview that his father had changed after that November incident. Not drastically, but noticeably. He became quiet, Jorge said. He had always been a man of few words, but after that, it was different, as if he knew something but didn't want to discuss it, and he never drove down that road at night again. Beatrice, his daughter, was more specific. According to her, about a year after the incident, at the end of 1987, her father once said to her over dinner a single sentence that she remembered word for word. There was something beyond the road. I didn't look for long. I think I did the right thing. He never brought up the subject again. Pedro Oliva Ramirez died on October 28, 2017, at the age of 78. The doctor's conclusion was heart failure. His son Jorge said that his father remained lucid until the very end, remembered everything, never once in his life changed a single detail of that November story, and never once tried to offer any explanation for it. So, what are the documented facts? There is a man with an impeccable reputation, of sound mind, with no history of mental illness. There is testimony that has remained unchanged for 31 years. There is confirmation of abnormal moisture on an object from the car that night. There is a time discrepancy. The 16-kilometer route took Pedro over an hour, of which at least 40 minutes cannot be explained by travel on the province's actual roads. There are odometer readings that contradict both the clock and the speedometer simultaneously, and not in favor of any known mechanical malfunction. There is a gap in the technical documentation for that section of the road. And there are, as awkward as it may sound, several people from different sources who have described unexplained road anomalies in the same geographical area. Attempts have been made to provide a rational explanation. The most common of these is microsleep while driving. The driver falls asleep for a few seconds. The car continues moving. The driver wakes up in an unfamiliar place, turns around, and finds the road he knows. This version does a good job of explaining the sensation of a sudden shift in space. It does not explain the 6-lane highway, the voices, the 8-minute interval between cars with unfamiliar license plates, the feeling of warmth on a November night, the discrepancy between the odometer and the clock, and, especially the fact that the distance from the point where he returned to the familiar road to Alcalá de Guadaira was half what it should have been if Pedro had simply taken a wrong turn. The second version is a dissociative episode, transient amnesia. Pedro could have experienced a brief disturbance of consciousness, wandered in an unknown direction for an hour, and then regained his bearings. This version also fails to explain the spatial anomalies regarding distance. Alcalá de Guadaira is located in a precisely defined place. From any point in the province, it can only be reached via actual roads. To reach its eastern entrance while traveling toward Seville, one would have had to either make a massive detour of several dozen kilometers or, which is physically impossible, end up ahead of the destination while moving away from it. A third theory was put forward anonymously in several Spanish online communities in the 2000s, a hoax for the sake of fame. This theory falls apart in the face of the simplest fact. Pedro was not seeking fame. He gave a few interviews because he was asked to, not because he sought them out. He turned down many requests for contact. He died at the age of 78 in the same apartment in Triana where he had lived his entire life, never having written a book, appeared on a TV show, or accepted money for his story. There is one detail that is rarely mentioned. When, in 2011, Carlos Ornelas asked Pedro to describe the voice, that voice that stood out from the general chorus and said that everything was fine, that he had been transported to another dimension, Pedro replied something like this: "It didn't sound like it was coming from outside. It sounded like a thought you haven't thought yet, as if it had appeared right here." And he put his hand to his forehead, not to his ear, to his forehead. What exactly happened on November 9, 1986, on the road between Seville and Alcalá de Guadaira? No one knows. Perhaps there is an explanation for this that we simply do not yet know. Perhaps it lies in physics that has not yet been described. Perhaps in psychology that has not yet been mapped. Or perhaps, and this is the most uncomfortable possibility, there is no explanation, because what Pedro Oliva Ramirez experienced lies on the other side of what we call reality. 6 lanes, 8 minutes, 14 kilometers on the odometer in an hour's drive, and a voice that sounds like a thought you haven't yet had. Tell us, would you have stopped? Or, like Pedro, would you have just kept driving?